Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie.com. And I'm here today with a very, very special guest, Con Chrysoulis, who is a distinguished multidisciplinary artist and academic with extensive experience in the field of graphic novels. He's currently a lecturer of commercial art and illustration at Teesside University in England, where he's joining us from today, where he teaches undergraduates and postgraduate courses in comics and graphic novels and concept art. His diverse body of work includes notable titles such as Tales of the Smiths and Rebel Rebel, which explore the lives of iconic musicians through compelling visuals and engaging storytelling. And we're going to talk today about that latter project, which is the ongoing graphic biographical series about David Bowie. And you see one of the covers of one of the editions, the fifth edition, behind me, and you'll see some others throughout the course of this interview. So, Con, thank you very much for joining me. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you decided to launch this particular project.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on your blog, John. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so the project. So I began the project in 2018, right when Bowie died. Although it was already being planned in 2017 as the follow-up project to Rebel Rebel to Tales of the Smiths. So what had been happening was that no, did I say 2018 when Bowie died? Yeah, I meant 2016. So what happened was I'd been already working as a webcomics artist for well, I've been working in comics for many, many years. How back should I be going? I'll go a bit further back. I'll try to be real quick about this just in
Yeah.
case your audience is not aware of where I'm coming from. So I've worked as a kind of a comics artist for maybe 25, 30 years now, starting in Australia where I grew up. So I self-published there for years, just generic superheroic stuff. But then I moved to Athens, Greece, in the late 90s. And starting kind of in the early noughties, I became part of one of the instigators of kind of the new scene there. And I was self-publishing for more mature stuff there. So I was commenting a lot on what was going on in Athens at the time, kind of a lot of social upheaval, but I also had some comedic series and some other stuff going on at the same time. But that got me on my name known there, and actually I became one of the kind of the staple kind of comics artists in Greece of the new generation there. But then the kind of financial crisis happened in Greece. And as just as Greece got the got bailed out financially, I bailed out of the country to the UK. Um, so I moved to Brighton initially, and in the UK, and yeah, I continued where I left off, except that in Greece, I was kind of just awarded kind of comics book artist of the year. And in England, no one knew me. It meant nothing, you know.
Yeah.
So at that point, I wanted to get out of kind of the really social political stuff that I was working on for so long. And it's taken up a lot of my time and a lot of my space, a lot of my creativity, and it was a lot of my kind of mental health too, to be fair. And I wanted to move into kind of other areas. I was starting to explore like graphic biographies. So I started doing the graphic biography of the Smiths, the band The Smiths.
Yep.
And that began as a web comic and it was a daily web comic for a Greek chocolate company. I don't know, this is like really, it will take too long to explain, but a
I
chocolate company.
normally do not associate the Smiths with Greek chocolate. I just have to tell you.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a really bizarre one. But what happened was just as I'd left Greece, a chocolate company in Greece, the biggest chocolate company in Greece, kind of the equivalent of Cadbury called Eon, wanted to reach out to a new audience, you know, to new consumers. And they contacted Greece's kind of most prominent comics creators to do comics for them. Except then this was the good thing about it. They didn't care about the content. What they cared about was that you're there, that you're present, and that you're doing stuff for them. So I got paid to do a daily webcomic, and I was free of kind of choosing whatever I wanted as as a topic. And I chose the Smiths, and they said they okayed it, which was bizarre. and I went with it. They gave me a 3 month period to kind of test it out, and it blew up. It went great with the Smiths fans all over the world, and that was about the formative years, the teenage years. This is what I was really interested in. So that's what I'm going to get in with Bowie too. As a fan of kind of Bowie and the Smiths and a lot of music groups, I'm not really. I know a lot already. From a fan, I know a lot already about the kind of the years where they were famous. I know a lot about Ziggy, the Ziggy years. I know a lot about the Smiths, when they recorded those albums in those 4 years that they existed. But in the biographies I'd read, that pre-existed, the prose biographies, that I couldn't find a lot of information about the teenage years, how the
Yeah,
personalities were formed, these experiences they had that a lot of biographies alluded to.
yeah,
And they'd say, oh, this happened in his life, he got beat up or something, and that this inspired his lyrics 10 years later. And you go, hey, this got a lot of meat actually, getting like beaten up by a lot of thugs in like London. It inspires your lyrics, but it surely means more, there's more to it than that. What's the context? What happened before and after?
yeah.
Um,
I don't want to get ahead of myself, but
yeah.
I am going to ask about uh, you devote quite a bit of time to Bowie's early years, which are not
Mm.
terribly well known. But I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think you're going
No.
in this direction anyway.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about your sources, and you're
Yeah.
just on the verge of getting into that,
Yeah. I was
both
just
in
gonna get,
terms of the
yeah.
story, and then I'm going
Hmm.
to pull up, take a closer look at this picture behind me,
Yeah.
your sources for images. But so you're researching Bowie's early life, you're reading books. There's not a lot about his
Mm.
early life in it. So where do you go for information?
Okay, so this is the twist, right?
Yeah,
And this is the difference between what I'm doing too, kind of like my sale pitch, let's say, to what other biographers have been doing already,
yeah,
and especially what other graphic biographers are doing, what other graphic novels. Because I mean, with Bowie especially, he's been, his life's been tackled by other graphic biographers too. The Now, what I've been doing is, instead of going to other biographies, which again I feel just barely brush on his kind of formative years, I try to find as many sources as possible of Bowie himself narrating his experiences. Now, how do I do that? I purchase a lot of old music magazines, especially,
yeah,
or I listened to a lot of radio kind of conversations that he had, or TV appearances, and I try to zone in, as much as possible. So, you can miss these details if you're not concentrating a lot. And I try to find a um, quotes where Bowie's narrating his own life, or experiences that he had at an early age. And believe it or not, if you look hard enough, you'll see that not only Bowie but the Smiths and any other person that's been interviewed, so much, at that extent, throughout their lives, you'll find that they've talked about a lot of things that have not been reported on in the past. And so that applies to Bowie, but it also applies to a lot of his acquaintances. So I do the same with Tony Visconti or George Underwood. So if any of his acquaintances have spoken to the press in the past, I'll try to find these quotes. Now, what I do is I get these quotes and I place them. I have a kind of a spreadsheet, and I place them in order of kind of significance, but also in thematic order. So, let's say the moment where Bowie's eye gets punched out by George Underwood in a fist fight, I'll take those. There's been a multitude of quotes there, so that's one problem. And the other problem is that a lot of the quotes are conflicting. So George Underwood would say, I punched his eye out, and Bowie would say his fingernail got caught in my eye, and it caused that permanent damage to one of his eyes. They'd also conflict regarding the reason why. Was it a girl? Was it another reason? So there's various quotes there that are conflicting, and I have to find kind of a middle truth there. And that's where I have to kind of I'd say, create a identify, the credibility of each quote. So, sometimes it might just be hearsay, like fans saying something on social media. Other times it might be and then I'd chase it up. to see if there's actually any substance to it. Other times, it might be a direct quote from Bowie from an interview from the 70s. Other times, it might be like an acquaintance's interview now in 2023, 24.
Yeah.
And that's also a bit fishy because what happens is Bowie's now dead, so
Yeah.
he can't refute it, and no one else can either. And a lot of times you'll see that there a lot of the Bowie's acquaintances are looking back at Bowie in a almost kind of hagiographical way,
Yeah.
So I don't take quotes. I try to, I suppose, dissect them as much as possible, regarding their credibility. So
Right.
so that's, yeah, so I create a linear kind of narrative out of all those quotes. And then the story starts evolving from that. Yeah.
So I want to take a look at some of the visual images. You're working on a
Yes.
visual medium, and ask you about the sources for that too. And while you were talking
Mm.
about the story about George Underwood punching him in the face, I pulled up
Yeah.
the cover of issue 4, which depicts that. I'll come back to
Yes.
that, but just something that occurs. Have you depicted any incidents or conveyed any information in your series that you haven't seen reported anywhere else?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I recently, well, recently is like a year ago because I've been doing this for since 2016. I mean, yeah, I should have. I was going to say before that I finished Tales of the Smiths. That was really successful. It got published as a collection from Omnibus
Yeah.
Press, and then the same chocolate company hired me to continue with another series. And in 2015, we agreed to do Bowie, and then Bowie died.
Yeah.
So we'd already agreed to it. And I caught onto it immediately after he died, and it almost felt like I was getting on a bandwagon. But I was already working on it for almost 2 years to that point. In any case, um, so yeah, I have uncovered quite a lot of things that have never been spoken about or have been briefly brushed upon. So a lot of things. I'm not going to say that I'm discovering everything, but I'm unraveling it.
Right.
So we knew that Bowie had at some point gone to a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery at some point called Samueling in Scotland. But when was not kind of clear. We knew it was kind of like around the time where he released his debut album, and what occurred there, rather than like a quote or two, was not really clear.
Yeah.
So I got into that. I was discussing that about a year ago. I tried to amass as much information as possible on that from Rinpoche, so the person that from quotes from Rinpoche, Chaim Rinpoche, who was his kind of mentor, from Bowie himself, quotes from and various other Lindsay Kemp, who he'd just met before going to the monastery. So I tried to find as much information as possible from the subjects themselves talking about that experience and unravel. So that's just one case. So that became, from I thought I wouldn't find anything on that, and actually it went on to kind of like a 10-page sequence in which and if you know from my comics, it's kind of like a text-heavy page each time.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It was a lot of information, yeah, that hadn't been spoken about. That's just one case.
Fascinating. So
Yeah.
let's look at some of your art, and I'm gonna start. I showed the cover of 4, but let's take for before we come back to that. Let's take a closer look at the image that is behind me, and I'm going to ask a specific question about this. So this is the cover of chapter 5,
Right.
and
Yes.
why don't you tell us what was the source material that you based this graphical depiction on? Like what
Yeah.
this was based on a picture.
Yeah. So this is kind of like a one of the easier ones where my kind of the decisions I had to make, well, the creative decisions, but I already had a kind of a source that was kind of clear and definite, to kind of base it on. So yeah, this is based on a photograph of Bowie with his kind of his saxophone when he kind of just joined the Conrads. So I should say that the episodes that I have as a webcomic, it's a weekly webcomic since 2016. I gather about 20 episodes, and each episode's collected then as a chapter. And in this chapter, and it's then posted to the people supporting the Patreon. So in this chapter, I collected 20 or 24 episodes. I can't remember how many. And they relate to his experience with the Conrads. So immediately after getting his eye damaged from George Underwood, um, one of the way that George Underwood could repent was to get Bowie to join the Conrads, in which he was already in. Um, so yeah, I found kind of a photograph from the time,
Yeah.
and using my kind of, I've got this cross hatching kind of well, it's not cross hatching technique. It's kind of like this squiggly, almost jangly, triangular kind of inking technique. Um, I tried to kind of draw his likeness, but then also add the curtain at the back to kind of depict kind of the theatrical scenes that he was performing in
Yeah.
at the time. So yeah, I'm going for kind of a black and white grayish aesthetic. And if you notice, if you look at the covers from like chapter 5, 6, 7, they're almost all of them are grayscale. Because then in when kind of psychedelia kicks in Britain, everything goes kind of technicolor, and there's an explosion of colors both in Bowie's life but also on my covers. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's so the kind of the technical choices here are to go intentionally grayscale to kind of depict that Bowie's still in that pre kind of mop head kind of Beatle-ish era. He's still going,
So this was from the mid '60s, right? He's a teenager here.
he's still a teenager, so this
Yeah.
is like around 63, I think. The Conrads were about around 63, I believe.
Yeah.
Because yeah, he recorded Liza Jane, which was his first single with the King Bees in 64. So it must have been 63, if I recall right. And so this was like right at the tail end of the 1950s Teddy Boyish
Yeah.
kind of aesthetic being kind of the predominant aesthetic in the UK. And then right afterwards, Beatlemania kicking in and the mods coming in, all that kind of like turned on its head. And we went to a kind of a very different phase of, slowly going, if you consider the Beatles haircut a kind of an effeminate haircut like they did at the time, like slowly going from, this the pre-Beatles aesthetic to a more um, androgynous aesthetic, which
Yeah.
Bowie followed to the max, within a 10-year period, if you think about it.
Yeah. The other thing that the photo that this is based on, I've always thought it
Mm.
was interesting that he would return to a look that's very similar to this 20 years later. And if you think
Yes.
about all his style changes in between,
Mm.
it's at least interesting. But let me pull up
I'd say he
another.
went to that 10 years later, like around Young Americans. And then he
Yeah.
went again to it 10 years later around, um,
Let's dance.
Let's Dance. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's because if you lived in that era, it's hard for like to communicate this to a new generation. But if you lived in those years, if you remember, like in the early 70s and the early 80s, there was um, re-emerging of 50s music and 50s aesthetic,
Yeah.
especially in the early 70s, which fed into other stuff too.
I'm not to get off subject, but I'm always struck. I'm 55 years old, and when I was a child and I would watch Happy Days, it seemed to be about ancient history. But
Yeah,
that show started um, less than it started about 15 years after the time it was depicting,
yeah,
um, which is
yeah.
just today it sort of blows my mind. But let's take a look at this cover. This is I pulled it up briefly before when you were describing this incident
Yes.
where Bowie's friend George Underwood punched him in the face. And
Mm,
I think there's a common misperception that his eyes were two different colors, but
mm,
that wasn't exactly accurate. The one was, as you just said, the one was injured by this incident again when he was a teenager. And
mhm,
I part of the reason I'm pulling this up is that unlike the previous cover, you had to imagine this moment. There's no photograph of this moment. So
mm,
how do you go from taking an image that is based on an actual photograph
Hmm.
to one that you essentially have to imagine. And I'm going to ask you that, and then I also want to ask you a couple questions about the technique that you used here versus the
Yeah.
previous one. So
Yeah.
how'd you go
So,
out and create
mm,
this image out of scratch?
mm. So yeah. So one of the big problems that graphic biographers have, compared to someone writing, a story of, that's pure fiction, is that you have to. Well, you don't have to, but if you're feeling that you want to depict your subject in a truly kind of authentic way, in a way um, that is not, that is purely based on facts, then one of the first problem that you face is how do you do it the minute you're kind of like drawing those in between moments where there's absolutely no evidence of what happens, of what was spoken and what and how they behaved, how what the gestures of their bodies were like. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's various kind of ways that you could go about that, and I mean, I've kind of looking back at it, and the method I've been using for the past kind of 15 years almost now that I've been working on purely on graphic biographies is kind of a method, almost a method writing um method, like a Stanislavski approach to but not to acting, but to drawing. So I try to kind of once I've gathered all those kind of quotes, all those facts, and I've been, I don't gather them in a day. This is the thing, it's this I'm slowly accumulating these all these kind of real life events that happen in Bowie's life. So they're constantly kind of in my mind, and I'll go back and forth with them. I've got a live document that's online all the time. And I might be outside and I'll find something and I'll add it to that document. So I'm constantly ruminating, and I'll dip in and out of these moments, try to relive them. And to be fair, this is something I don't know, because the first question was why you're doing this. A lot of the times the graphic biographer feels, a certain amount of relates to a certain degree with their subject. And by using this kind of by meditating on what I've written, sitting back, kind of not rushing into kind of drawing it immediately or depicting exactly what's described in the quote. I'll sit back and kind of think about, okay, how's what does Bowie actually, is actually like at this time? What is surroundings like? What's happening at the same time in terms of, sociocultural context? So there's a lot of factors that I'll try to, sit back, meditate on in an almost Stanislavski type way. Um, so Stanislavski says that I don't know if you've looked into the method acting at all, but he'll suggest to the actor that other than reading the script, the first thing you do is read the script. But beyond that, he says to the actor that the first thing you should be doing is drawing your subject, drawing the situation that they're in. Is that even though they might not be, you know, good at drawing, or they might not have drawn at all, but he urges them to kind of get this primal um, form of communicating, through drawing on paper, and then to ruminate on what they've drawn and how these primal feelings can be expressed through a narrative, to
Yeah.
incorporate
So
it
let
in
me
their
ask you
acting.
a couple questions about your technique here, because we
Yeah,
saw two different pictures that depict two different techniques, and I just want to draw
yeah,
attention to a couple things that are happening in
yeah.
this. So, um, black, white, blue, yellow, and red.
Hmm.
The previous picture, which I'll pull up again, has a lot of more, as you were saying. It was mostly grayscale, and it was
Yeah.
using a lot of texturing techniques, whereas this
Hmm.
is more stark. And
Mm.
what are you going for here? And just to sort of direct your thoughts, the red of the blood
Hmm.
really stands out.
Yeah.
So, what were you trying to communicate with that, and how did you do it? What did you do here to make that red really stand out?
Yeah, I suppose my kind of studies or my work in the past as a graphic designer and illustrator is where this kind of plays in here. So I'm trying to contrast. The first thought here was, well, of course, to depict the scene, But then to contrast the blood, that's the first thing that came into my mind um, when I was going to depict the scene. So the blood was the kind of the predominant element that I wanted to pop out, and
Yeah.
so the choice of colors there, when it came to kind of the yellow blue, was to use colors that will contrast and make the help allow the red to pop out of the canvas almost. If you look at I've got this actually the issue here. If you look at the printed edition, well, all the printed editions actually, what happens is the back cover kind of corresponds to the front cover, so it's kind of it's continuing the front cover somehow.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
in this, and all the back covers um, have a kind of a well, this is the latest issue, um, and he's in front of kind of a window, um, a record store window, and the store kind of continues there on the side. But in this case, and every back cover's got kind of a that lightning bolt motif, and in this case, kind of it's the blood that's just continuing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of the predominant element. And you don't associate Bowie with violence at all, or his life with kind of including, you wouldn't expect, that it would include so many moments of violence, but and yet it did. This is another thing perhaps that I've also concentrated a lot on. So those expanding on those moments of violence, he gets beaten up a few times for looking a bit effeminate, for having really long hair for the early 1960s. There's also other moments where there's allegate. Well, this is alleged, but I expand on it. Um, that he got molested on a trip with one of his bands to the Isle of Wight. So there's moments there that you wouldn't expect to read in a bog standard, graphic biography of David Bowie. But yeah, I believe that all these moments kind of like played a huge role in his life. And in this case, again, it's kind of I suppose concentrating on on the shock value, I suppose, of the blood
Yeah.
pouring out of his eye. A lot of times, they'll talk about Bowie's eyes being different, this alien look and all that. And what they won't kind of discuss in detail at least is that his eye dilated to the point where it was, he's had blurred vision in one eye for the rest of his life. And although it served its purpose in him looking alien-esque, in the early 70s, as its bodily function, its
It,
functionality wasn't, the one that he'd desire it to be.
its use as of his eye as an eye.
Yeah, yeah.
So
He's
it,
quoted again and again though as saying that George Underwood did him a huge favor in terms of his look being really standing out because of that accident.
so before we move off this picture, I just want to draw attention to anyone who's taking a look at it because I'm going to pull up that earlier one and then move on to a third. That I just want to draw attention to what's really standing out are the colors here versus the
Yeah.
texture. And I'm going to pull up that earlier one just very
Mm,
quickly, where um, if you look at this carefully, you're really highlighting the texture. And if you look really carefully at the suit, for instance, you're using I know there's a a technical word for it, but you're using dots to convey the
yeah,
texture of the
half-toned.
suit.
Yeah.
Yeah, halftones. And you mentioned something earlier. You mentioned a term
Mm,
inking, and I remember from reading Marvel comics, you'd see the credits, and somebody was credited with doing the penciling and the inking and
yes.
the coloring. And I think you're doing all of that. So just very
Yes.
quickly before I pull up my third image,
Yeah.
what is that? What is all of that? What's the process of actually composing
Yeah.
a picture for this format?
Okay, so I mean the standard process of creating a comic is to write a script and then draw that script and then color the drawings and then put the letters in or do it all at the same time and then get it published. So if you're working on your own, if you're not working in a team like I am at the moment, well, I've barely worked within a team in the past. I've mostly worked as a creator, as a comics creator on my own, as an individual or solo creator. Um, I do all the things on my own. So my process is to start with that, accumulating the quotes, accumulating all the data, creating a linear narrative. So I've got a linear script going on at the same time after that, and then I go into penciling. So that means rough drawing with pencils, what I want my page to look like. And that's done on I haven't got any pencils here, unfortunately. I've got the inks though. And that's kind of at this is like a future episode that I'm working on
Yeah.
now.
But
That's done
what
on
is
a
is that on paper or is that a different
yeah.
material? Yeah,
So it's
paper.
on paper, so I'm still drawing traditionally.
Yeah.
I haven't gone full digital yet. I think I never will. So I'm still drawing on paper. That's one thing. And once after the pencils, I go into an inking phase. So I ink with I can show you my materials actually. I ink with yeah, like markers that are really small point markers, like 0.1s, 0.1, 0.2 markers. And I'll also ink though with a brush pen, like a pencil brush pen. So this
Yeah.
is a brush um that has a cartridge in it. You don't have to dip it into an inkwell. So uh, what happens is that you usually draw when you're doing comics on a fairly large scale, and then you scale it down to the smaller size when you want to print it. But I've been drawing on extra small scale, like almost the size that it's being printed on, for reasons of convenience, really, for about the past 15 years. So this is an A5 piece of paper. It's really small. So
Yes.
on this piece of paper, you've got two episodes, really. It's another episode. What um what I do is, then the reason for this is because I can stick it into this kind of into this little plastic sleeve that I've got, put it in my backpack, and walk around town, get on a train, get on an airplane, go to work. And whenever I've got 2 minutes, I can get in, continue drawing. Because it needs me to be onto it all the time in order to push out those episodes every week. So I've gone to this really small size of A5. Um, out of convenience. But
Yeah.
so once I finish the sketches, once I finish the inking with the black markers, so black markers are used traditionally in comics because the line art of a pencil, you could draw just a penciled comic, that would be fine, but it's really hard to reproduce it when you're printing. So you in comics you have to ink your pencils, rub out the pencils, and the work that's left is almost like a black and white outline of humans. And
Yeah.
then I scanned that and color it in using Adobe Photoshop. So
Okay.
that's the software I've been using for the past 20
Yeah.
or 25
Great.
years
Okay.
probably.
I'm going to pull up another image
Yeah.
so people could see more of this great art. And I've got a well, let me
Yeah,
just
there's a lot of other things that go into kind of drawing, like who your influences are, how that
yeah.
style's kind of seeped into your own style. But I'll go into kind of like a lot of comic booky jargon, which is not kind of won't help your audience. I assume, like talking about, artistically who's influenced me, and because there's a lot of things that play out when you're drawing for years, and you inevitably then remove yourself or evolve from people that you draw like to having your own aesthetic, your own style. But that's a massive conversation to have.
Yeah, I saw you did a graphic biography of Jack Kirby, the famous artist who worked with Stan Lee and really even much earlier than that, back to the 40s.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Is he one of your influences?
Yeah, definitely. I
Yeah,
went through I was drawing at some point semi naturalistically, semi
yeah,
realistically, and then I went through a really big Kirby phase where all my art started becoming, cubic, abstract almost. And actually the comic I got awarded for in Greece was a Kirby-esque comic called Giant Size Fascist, in which I was talking about the rise of the far right in Greece, but in a set in the 1960s as superheroes. And this went bonkers, there when it was really it was received well by kind of leftist audience, but the right wingers went crazy about it. In any case, I went through a really heavy Kirby phase, and once you go through a phase where you're much like with music, right, where your influences, um, you're trying to emulate your influence so much, it's really hard to shake it off and kind of go through, shake it off, well, shake it off consciously, and then go, okay, where am I? Who am I? What's my style? How do I go get out of this aesthetic and do something that's me? And the only way you could realize this is if, if someone else tells you, oh, oh, this is something else, something new. It's not Kirby-esque anymore,
Yeah.
Much
Yeah.
like with musicians who go through like 50s, 60s,
Right.
70s, whatever phases,
So this is, I think, was this the cover of the first chapter?
Yeah, this was the first
Yeah.
edition of the first
Yeah.
chapter. So yeah, so much like so that's the first, and this is the second edition of that. So this is the one that I've
Yeah.
been publishing since. So
Okay.
the first time I self-published the episodes, they were with that cover you've got on screen.
So let me briefly show that one, which I have
Yeah.
conveniently enough. There's that,
Mm,
but I want to go back
yeah.
to the earlier version
Sure, yeah.
just for a moment. Just again, I want to sort of, you're mentioning this is not in the style of Jack Kirby, but I think I'm
No.
seeing some techniques that maybe he might have used, or are common techniques that you're applying in a unique way. And I want to ask about two things in particular.
Hmm.
The one is there are two colors here, red and yellow,
Yeah.
and red and yellow together. Um, why I have an idea, but why did you choose to illustrate this picture using those two colors and those two colors alone?
Why don't you tell me your idea first, and then I'll see if we can.
Yeah.
Do you want
Well,
to go first? I don't mind. Is it a
okay.
consumer thing?
Well, red and yellow together are very. They evoke hot emotions, and
Hmm.
I'll maybe less so for a British audience, but an American
Mm.
audience can picture the professional wrestler Hulk Hogan, who would deck himself out in red and yellow, and he'd rip off his shirt, right? And why those colors? Because they're hot colors. They get your blood boiling.
Hmm.
And I think in the context of this picture, first of all, the Bowie is posed, he has sort of a pensive pose, but it
Hmm.
just, especially in the beginning of something, it's just sort of, it's almost like the energy and the emotion is boiling over and it's about to explode into something.
Hmm.
And so, especially in contrast to the cool colors of the very first image that I was
Yeah.
showing, it seems like it's almost conveying a kinetic potential. So is that right, or am I totally off base?
Um, I'd say yeah. Yeah. I think you're spot on.
Yeah,
So there's other things going on too, like always facing to the right. It's a book, so
yeah,
in terms of right etiquette when it comes to technique to get a consumer to read your book, it's best that any action that's flowing in left or right direction, that it's best that it flows on the cover to the right, so it can lead to the page turn. So that's
yeah.
one thing.
Amazing. Yeah, wow.
So there's a lot of thought like that going on. I should say that I think you mentioned at the start, I'm the course leader of the BA, the Bachelor in Illustration course at Teesside
Yeah,
University. So this is bog standard kind of techniques that I talk about when we do cover illustrations with students. Um, so other things going on, yeah, of course, there's a lot of color theory going on as well. So the reason why I did this was the very first collection of Rebel Rebel. And I collected, this was before I had the Patreon. So I was still getting hired by the chocolate company to host the webcomic on their website.
yeah,
But then that stopped, right? So I was with them for 10 years, and that stopped, and I had to find a way to continue funding it somehow. And I went to Patreon, which is where I've been since. And but I hadn't published anything yet because I was getting it funded through the webcomic. So around that time, I was going to attend. I got a table at Thought Bubble Festival, which is the biggest independent comics festival in the UK. It's possibly becoming one of the biggest in the world now. It's not a superhero cosplay-ish type festival. It's although it's very welcoming, it's mostly creator-owned comics that are being sold there. And that's really that's being held every year, really close to where I live now in York in the UK. So I was going to attend there in 2018 for the first time, and I wanted to start selling these collections of the comic book, as a periodical rather than, as an incentive for people to come onto the Patreon as well. And So the first problem was, do I depict Bowie? So in this issue, the episodes, he's still a youngling. He's almost, I think the episode's
Yeah.
finished when he's like 8 years old or something in this issue. So do I depict him? Will anyone recognize him? Like if this cover didn't say Rebel Rebel, this is the
Right.
second issue. Would you
Yeah.
know that that's Bowie? You would, most probably you won't. This is Bowie with his brother from the second issue, chapter
Yeah.
2. So the problem there was, what do I put on the cover to make it a bit more eye-catching, a bit more recognizable. So I chose the Ziggy Stardust era, even though the content is not about it. But I can get
Yeah.
into that in a bit because in many ways it is. Um, and So I chose that the outfit that he'd be wearing, the age he'd be in, the recognizability of the image. And then the second thing I chose was the colors, which was, if you look at color theory in terms of, product advertorial or product illustrations, you'll find that orangish, reddish, and orange yellow colors are very much tied to attracting consumers, and so a lot of supermarkets have used those
Yeah.
colors in their banners and things like that. So it's again, it has a lot to do with appealing to emotions, but it also it has to tie into what the product is about. Of course, you don't just put yellow reds on any product, and so this does kind of correlate to what Bowie was all
Yeah.
about, as you mentioned. I should also mention this is part of a triptych because at the time I was drawing all my three subjects for my graphic biography is Jack Kirby, um, David Bowie, and Morrissey in this kind of sideways view. And this is the banner I use at my convention attendances.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
Look,
this
I'm
is
going
this
to
is
ask
a
you one
business card.
last question about that one picture, and I want to show a couple, and then I'm going to move on to a couple other topics because you
Mm.
won't believe this, but time is flying, and we've been talking for about 50 minutes.
Jeez,
Which
jeez.
I feel like I could talk to you all day. Very quickly, though, there's a technique that I see here that I've seen before,
Mhm.
where you're using these jagged lines to
Yeah,
multiple effects. And
yeah.
just in case anybody's not zeroing in on what I'm talking about, you're using
Hmm.
jagged lines to depict his hair, to depict
Hmm.
some of the texture of the fabric, to depict light onto the face. And
Mm.
what's going on there? What's the trick?
What's the trick? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a so that goes down to, I suppose, the influences I was talking about, which go down to the influence I have from comics predominantly, mostly from 1960s, I'd say 1970s comics,
yeah.
and a lot of underground comics too. So I'm a
That's
huge,
where I was gonna try to make the Jack Kirby connection, but I had
yeah.
to interrupt. Yeah,
There's different. So Kirby wasn't an inker. He did ink some stuff,
yeah,
but yeah, his work was inked by others most of the times in a very catastrophic manner. So his inkers weren't a good pair. They destroy his artwork, like Vince Colletta famously. But in the underground scene, there's an artist called, well, he's, you know, let's say alternative, I should say underground. There's an artist called Charles Burns, who's done a kind of, I don't know, like lately the work that he's mostly known for is Black Hole, a series called Black Hole. So that his work is characterized by contrasting shadows that use this kind of the brush to portray the blurring of shadows, into kind of from black to light. So
yeah,
there's artists like that, or Baldacini, or or a lot of inkers in, from mainstream comics that have influenced that style. So it's kind of a striking way, I suppose, to create a kind of a duotone effect in which you don't need to use, a plethora of colors to depict, to portray light and shadow. And in fact, as a graphic device, it can become quite striking. It's something I've been dabbling with a lot in the past, but I've certainly, with the Bowie comic, I've certainly kept kind of that specific aesthetic
Yeah.
right from the start. Yeah.
So I want to very quickly show just a couple other images to also sort of illustrate something that you were saying a few minutes ago, which was that
Mm.
initial image is very recognizable. And you held up an edition that I didn't download in advance
Oh yeah.
that might be less recognizable, but I did pull up this one, and this
Right.
is
Yes.
from an episode where Bowie in the early '60s appeared on television, but
Yeah.
if you just randomly glanced at that, you might not realize who it was.
Yeah.
It occurred to me that your initial visual introduction of Bowie
Mm.
was very recognizable, and although your subsequent content is really focusing on a less well-known part of his life. And
Hmm.
I'm going to show one other image like that, and then I want to ask just a couple of questions about Bowie in particular.
Yes.
And Khan, I feel like we could talk all day, and
Yes.
um, I have to be conscious that people do not devote all day to watching a video. So
Yeah.
here's another one. It's like
I don't
if
know,
you
man. There's
yeah.
like people like scrolling on TikTok for like endlessly.
So here's another one that I think you need to be lured into the story and
Yeah.
get into it before
Yeah.
you recognize that this is an image that has anything to do with David Bowie at all.
This
So
is
just very
definitely
very quickly,
obscura territory.
yeah, you're telling a story though here. So just very quickly, what is this before I get to some more general questions about Bowie?
Yeah, so I mean the previous image where he was on the tally screen
Yeah,
was when he first appeared on television for the first time before he was well known
yeah,
as part of a squad of like teenagers that had long hair. He had the longest hair in London at the time for a kind of a male or man individual. So he was part of a group. Well, it was really a promotional device from his manager to get his Bowie known. He had a manager from really early on, from like 1963, perhaps, called Leslie Kahn. And so he created an organization called the International League for the Preservation of Animal Filement, and which evolved into another organization. These are all fake, fictitious organizations, right? Which was called the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. And they use this as bait so they can go on TV. And surely, he was invited to BBC to talk about why, a boy in the early 1960s would leave his hair as long as that. That was quite shocking at the time in Britain. No one had left long hair like that since kind of the Victorian ages.
yeah,
Um, and so yeah, I'm using this. In the Bowie community, of course, it's a famous moment, but anyone else sitting outside might go, "What?" So yeah, he went to television and he was being really kind of tongue in cheek, like talking in a really kind of camp manner about why he's got long hair. He famously said, I bumped into someone and he said, "Can I hold your handbag for you?"
yeah,
Or something like that. So he was being really campy about it and having fun with it. But it's for me, this was a great moment because Bowie was on TV, and for the first time, he wasn't famous yet, and he was trying to use that moment, those 5 minutes he'd have, those 15 minutes, to make the best of it. And he did. People remember that moment in Britain, um, mostly as a kind of a camp cheesy moment.
my
But
favorite
yeah,
moment from that interview is when the older man doing the interview says, "Are you just doing this because of the Rolling Stones?" And
yeah,
they're all
right.
like, "No, no. Why would you ever think that?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, in fact, in this collection, it talks about about just prior to this, he goes to a gig, a Rolling Stones gig, and someone shouts out to, and this is something that Bowie narrated later on at the start before starting a song at a concert. He was talking about this moment, and so he went to a Rolling Stones gig, and someone shouts out to Mick Jagger, "Oi, why you got that long hair?" or something like that. You look like a lady or something, and he goes, "What? I look like you?" And everyone just laughed and booed, that person out. So yeah, it was a quite rebellious thing to do. Yeah.
So,
Um,
so this
yeah.
one, what are you telling us with this image here?
So with this image, although I went to slowly, the images went from black and white to color, as I mentioned. Suddenly
Yeah.
in chapter 12, and we've reached 1967 here, it goes bang back to black and white. And the reason is because he started performing with the Riot Squad, which was a really artistic band for its time. You know, really influenced by Pink Floyd's sound kind of explosion uh, uh, gigs that they did in London at the time, which were a mix of sound and vision. Like great kind of projections at the in the background, poetry readings, things like that. So he started hanging out anyway with the Riot Squad. Even though his manager was pushing him to go into kind of like a solid career, he had abandoned all his bands before that. And he was doing this secretly. His manager didn't know it. And this is really impactful. This is an important moment because he wore makeup for the first time on stage with the Riot Squad, and they all kind of went out as different personas, let's say, not as defined as kind of Ziggy and things like that, which is already not really defined, but it was a great moment in that sense, in that Bowie, decided for the first time before even going into mime that he'd wear stage makeup and perform. So a lot of the times people think that Lindsay Kemp, and Lindsay Kemp wasn't a huge, this is where I am at the moment with Bowie. It was a huge influence in his life and the way that he'd act on stage. Um, and but a lot of people might think that Lindsay Kemp was, the absolute influence in terms of stage makeup. But yeah, prior to Lindsay Kemp, he wore stage makeup with the Riot Squad, and they were quite kind of colorful as characters on stage. It wasn't just that drab kind of hippie-ish look. It was a bit more adventurous than that.
Yeah. Wow. Um, really, really great stuff.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
let me pull the camera back a little bit and ask this. So this is a long-term project for you, and
Yes.
you couldn't do it if there wasn't an audience. And to me, you said you you
Mm.
you started before he died, but I've asked this question of other people who
Mm.
think or write about Bowie, and I'll deliberately mangle a phrase from one of his last songs. Something happened on the day he died.
Yeah,
And
right.
I mean, it seems to me like there's more interest in Bowie now
Mm.
than even in the last few decades of his life.
Mm.
What do you think is happening, and why the continued interest and maybe even increased interest in David Bowie?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's twofold. There's great interest in it, which is good for me because people I can tap into an audience, but there's also annoyingly a lot of interest. So to the point where there's too much noise in order to tap into the kind of the people that you could appeal to. Um, yeah, so I mean, Bowie's become Bowie was already larger than life artist during his lifetime, but he certainly became much bigger than that after his death. And this certainly does happen with most artists, because we were talking about that 50s resurgence in the early 80s. That definitely kicked off after Elvis's death in 77.
Right. Yeah.
There was again people started listening to Bill Haley and Elvis and all those acts because they felt nostalgic after Elvis died. So this certainly happened with Bowie too. Some of the larger audience, I feel, this is what I've been observing, have been, going back. They were already fans, so they're going back and revisiting their the artists they already liked. Others are finding out about Bowie now, which is great, a younger audience. But there's others like really random people that will, they've got really a really general idea about him, or are fans of his more kind of popular kind of outings, like Let's Dance, let's say.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's blown up a lot, and it's hard for me a lot of the times to communicate this with the Smiths book. It was way easier. It was believe it or not, to communicate this to the Smiths community. It was a more tight community. None of the members, or at least the big members like Morrissey or Johnny Marr, hadn't died. Knock on wood, they're still okay. Um, but it was way easier for me, even though they were alive. I wasn't tapping into a legacy brand, to tap into that audience. Now it's just crazy. It's he's everywhere. You go to like a novelty shop here in the UK, and there's Bowie kind of products everywhere. There's lightning bolt products.
Yeah.
It's kind of like almost like royalty type products, or like Beatles stuff. Yeah. So yeah, it's hard. For me, I'm trying to put a message across, that I'm not trying to milk his legacy. I'm
Yeah.
not there to kind of go, okay, he died. So here I'll do a digest, kind of short form of his entire life, in graphic novel form, like a 100-page comic. So I can, do a money grabber. I'm in it for the long run. I've got a personal interest in uncovering his life, because I feel there's a lot of connection there with what's happening with my life. I feel that the audience that's reading it too also connects with him in that way too.
Yeah.
Everyone's receiving it in a different way, of course. But I've got to, I've reached this far. I've done 420 pages, and I've only reached 968. So I might as well go for the long run. I might as well, cut that first ribbon. See, because I do have a vague idea of where I want a first, let's say, volume to end, which is about the time where he forms the hype, which is in 1970. And although you might go, oh, you're in 1968, that's just around the corner. If I've spent the last 4 years in 1967, 1968, so it's going to take a while to reach
Yeah.
1970. There's a lot of meat there. It's unbelievable how much stuff was happening to Bowie on a day, because a lot of times I get people, I'll say something that I'll correlate something that people kind of understand a bit more. A lot of times people go, oh, the Beatles, they existed only really from 63 to 1969, and yet they churned out what, 8 or 9 classic, like, albums where you can remember every single track, like
Yeah.
almost
Right.
150 tracks. And same with the Smiths, you can remember every single track from those 4 albums that they did. So with Bowie, it was, although 68 to 70 or 66 to 70, where he did those first kind of out that first debut album, which a lot of people perceive as being kind of really campy or cheesy, with Laughing Gnome, those types of songs. He was doing a lot of things that formed his later artistic decisions. And this is where I want to get, in terms of, the Ziggy Stardust stuff and the cover from the first collection, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I'm already doing that in many ways. So every kind of like 10 pages, I'll jump into how this correlates, what's happening in his past, how that corresponds to something that happened later on in his life. He'd meet a friend early on in his life. Um, and that friendship would last, for another 10 to 15 years. I'm like in this chapter, in chapter 2. So this is just episode of the webcomic, something like episode 34. I talk about how infatuated he was with Robert Heinlein, the science fiction
Yeah.
writer.
Yeah.
And I go into kind of um, a long kind of deep dive, and talk about how that in turn, fed into a lot of the narrative in Ziggy Stardust. So there's a lot of back and through. So even though I'm in 68, and someone might go, I really don't want to read about what Bowie was like as a hippie in 1968 or something, or his mime stuff. That a lot of people hate mime already. So would they want to read a comic about Bowie miming? In fact, what's happening is what I'm doing is I'm reflecting on how all this experience, was the backdrop of his famous years, of his famous gestures, of his famous, makeup, how he applied makeup, how he carried on stage, how he wrote songs, what he was influenced by, like writers like Heinlein. You know, instead of going to drawing, the famous years, Ziggy Stardust, which is what most graphic biographers do, and then kind of doing like really short bits where he talks about his past a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've alluded to this. Now people are watching this interview and they can't wait to start reading it. How can they do
Reckon?
that? Where can you
Yeah.
find either online or in print?
Yeah.
How do you get access to this?
So, I have a Patreon. If you don't know what Patreon is, Patreon
I'll
is.
put a link in
Oh,
the
great.
yeah.
There we go. So it's patreon.com/Rebel Comics. So what happens is, Patreon is a crowdfunding platform. Um, like Kickstarter, if you know Kickstarter. But instead of with Kickstarter, what happens is someone's trying to amass a big amount of money, let's say like 10 grand or something, and then print out a comic and send it, and then your relationship with them ends there and there. What I do is I try to I'm trying to get funding on a micro dosing scale. So small funding every month, so I can keep the costs running to keep doing the comic and the research. Um, so uh, someone can pay. So you pay in monthly installments. So if you pay just $1, which is ridiculous. I don't know. For some people, it might be too much. To be fair, I shouldn't have said that. But $1 is not a lot of money for a lot of people. Some people, for some it might be. Yeah, it might be insensitive. So for $1 a month, you can read the weekly comics for free. So it's a weekly comic. It's between 3 and 4 episodes per month. And with that $1, you can also read all the previous archive. So if you just pay $1, you can go and read all the previous episodes. And then if you continue backing with that $1, super cool. If you pay though the higher tier, reward tiers like $7 or $10, you can per month. Every 3 months, I'll send you one of the publications, and each publication contains 20 to 24 episodes.
Yeah.
So and they have those, specific covers. I also draw kind of a dedication for each person that receives it, a little doodle, and I sign each edition. So it's not just I don't just dryly put the thing in the envelope and send it to you. I do a dedication to you, and I draw a little doodle with Bowie on it and send it out. So every 3 months it's sent out. So in a year, if you back it with like $7 or $10 every month, in a year, every 3 months you receive an issue. So that means 4 issues in a year. So you'll receive, one, two, three, 4 issues in a year. So that's about 100 pages of episodes of materials printed out. And this is all over
Yeah.
the world, right? Not just the UK. So I've got patrons from the USA, predominantly from
Yep.
the USA and the UK,
Including
but
me.
I've got, yes, including you. Thanks a lot, John. And I've got a lot in Europe as well. So,
Yeah.
but they're predominantly in the USA. And although, I know there's a cost of living crisis, a really heavy cost of living crisis now going on in the UK. I see a lot of patrons, a lot of artists, that is, sorry, not patrons, kind of having to put the prices up. I'm keeping the prices as is, at least for kind of the next year, or more, because now my biggest problem is posting. Is costing a lot for a lot of sending these out to like the States, especially. But I'm keeping them down because I want these to reach the audience. It's not a thing of you might go, oh, you're getting $7 a month. That's like $30 every 3 months. Actually, the 2 of the months are going to printing and sending it out. So I have to try to get that message across. It's not a money-making venture. It's you're supporting the project to tag along until I finish it, because I've already got, as I
Yeah.
mentioned, I'm academic. I've already got a morning job, teaching and researching at Teesside University.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific, and thank you. I mean, this is a real contribution. And
Thanks, John.
yeah. So let me close with asking a question I ask everybody, and I'm going to put you on the
Yes.
spot, which is,
Ah.
what is your favorite David Bowie song and album?
Oh man, that's there. Jeez. Yeah. It's that
Everyone
changes
has
for
the same
everyone.
reaction.
Yeah, that change. Yeah, that's like, it's like Sophie's Choice. Uh, you feel like, if you don't say like low or something, that you're disowning your child and they're not going to speak to you again. It really changes. For a while it was Station to Station because I'd
Yeah.
been neglecting it for ages, and I was sick to death of listening to everything else. So I was like, both the song and the album. I was like massively obsessed with it for a while. I'd say now, because again, because I was listening to, I have to listen to the songs all the time. It's really hard for me to go, oh, this sounds fresh again, I'm actually going back to Ziggy Stardust again as my favorite album. This is crazy. It's like almost like a two classic choice.
Yeah.
And I'd say Lady Stardust. That is
Yeah.
hands down
Yeah.
now. Yeah,
Beautiful.
that
Yeah.
song, yeah. I mean, lyrically too, it gets my kind of like the hairs on my arm kind of to
Yeah.
stand up. It's a great song. And I didn't mention this at the start because one of the reasons I got really heavily into Bowie was Velvet Goldmine, the film, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
before that, I knew, I listened to a bit of Bowie and stuff. He was so mainstream though for my taste. I was really into grunge and other alternative stuff, and it just felt like I grew up as Bowie as being this mainstream artist in the '80s. It didn't appeal to me at all. And then Velvet Goldmine came out, and I was already a grown up, and I went, holy sheez, I'm really into like, Kiss and all these bands. And this is the template, he built this church, and Lady Stardust is really, although the soundtrack of Velvet Goldmine famously, he didn't allow his songs to go into Velvet
Right.
Goldmine. But for me,
Which I
Lady
think.
Stardust is the song, the
Yeah.
soundtrack to it,
Right. Yeah. I not to get sidetracked on that
Yeah,
because we should end on
yeah,
the
yeah,
the answer to that question. But I actually thought that it ended up working to the Todd Haynes, who made the movie, to his advantage. It gave
yeah.
him a kind of artistic flexibility while still conveying that sort of core message that's based in history. Anyway,
Oh yeah, yeah,
whole
yeah,
other
definitely.
topic.
That's
We
a,
can
that's
come
that's
back
that
and do
film's
film talk.
a lot of yeah, a lot of people think it's
Yeah.
hit and miss. For me, it's a masterpiece.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. There's so much that we didn't cover but
Oh, for
this
sure.
has been terrific, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but I might ask you back. So this was a really great conversation and wonderful art, and I'm really very excited that you're telling the story in the way that you're telling it. So,
Thanks,
Con
Sean.
Krasulis, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you for doing what you're doing.
That's
Uh,
great. Thanks for the conversation.
yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Yes, for sure.